This is chapter 13, Aggregate Planning and Sales and Operations Planning. In this chapter, we're going to look at the planning process involved in production. Sales and operations planning is part of that, and aggregate planning and aggregate planning strategies. These are the topics we'll be covering. And we will also look at 3 different methods of aggregate planning and some issues involved in aggregate planning in services. And then we look at a concept called revenue management. The planning process in an organization can be understood with this graphic. Here on the left side, we see the level of executives who will be involved in the planning process. And on the right, we see the actual planning activities that they will be responsible for. So at the top, we have long-range plans. The long-range plans would involve new product development and what are the research and development goals for the future, and large capital investments like building new plants and facility location and expanding your market share internationally, locally. So these are long-range planning activities, and typically, as you would expect, they will be done by top executives. So once these plans are laid out, then at the intermediate level, which will be more like about up to a year to a year and a half is what I would say. And here we actually start planning on major capacity needs up to about 18 months. And what are the expected sales, forecasted demand, and how that forecasted demand must be met in terms of producing the products and moving the products to markets, and what level of labor levels we need to maintain, how much inventory we have to maintain, how much subcontracting capacity that we need to develop around our production area. So these types of planning are done by the middle level managers, and coming down to the operations level managers, and they will be responsible for short-term planning. So once we have the medium-term overall production and sales goals set up, now you look at the short term up to about 3 months, disaggregate the planning levels from the aggregate plans into individual plans for individual products, and then come up with schedules for the individual products and who is going to do which job, ordering of inventory, and then any overtime that are needed, scheduling the overtime, and if temporary part-time help is needed, arranging for part-time temporary workers to be available. So these are done by the operations level manager at the shop floor. So we have levels of management and the type of planning activities in the production area to be done. Now, sales and operations planning is about the demand management, if you will. Okay. How much demand is going to be there for our products in the aggregate, and coordinating with all the internal and external agencies. External would be like vendors from whom we buy parts, and other government agencies are involved in getting permits and so on, or if export clearances and things like that. And then developing a necessary plan for the internal functional areas to complete the production. So communication across the board, making sure that the sales and sales projections are met. Now what sales and operations planning requires, so it requires a logical overall unit for measuring sales and output. A company can have tens or even hundreds of different products. Okay. There may be several models, and within each model there may be several product lines. Now when you're talking about sales planning for about 18 months, 1 year to 18 months, it is not feasible, or if it'll be time consuming and unnecessary to do plans for individual products. For example, if you take an automobile company and you say Honda has like Accord and Civic and add CRV, and so on. So there are many different product lines, and within each product line there are many models, and within each models there are products, unique products that are possible. So it is not necessary, and oftentimes will be impossible, near impossible, to develop overall long range plans for 1 year to 18 months and so on. So instead, if we can combine all of those and then try to forecast overall in the aggregate what the sales is likely to be and plan for those sales. So in order to combine, you need a logical overall unit to combine these different models, because your 1 unit of CRV is not going to be the same as, say, 1 unit of Civic. You can't just simply, these are apples and oranges, you cannot simply add them up, as we will see in an example in just a few minutes. So once you have the overall logical unit, then we have to find a forecast of demand for the period of sales planning, 6 months or typically 1 year to year and a half. Now once you have the forecast done, and that forecast can be met through production in several different ways, and we will look at those several different methods later on in this chapter. So we have to compare these different approaches to see which one would be the most efficient for us to adopt. And efficiency here comes down to cost. So we need to have a method of determining the cost of the alternative plans. So we have to have a plan about how to determine the cost of each of these different plans. So we have to combine all of this forecast and the resources available and the cost, and then you come up with a plan for meeting the forecasted demand. So that's your sales and operations planning process. So part of that is your aggregate planning. So what is an aggregate plan? Aggregate plan is a way of meeting the forecasted demand. So aggregate planning is to meet forecasted demand, and it is done in the aggregate. So you're not going to do this for individual products. You're going to combine all the different products into a combined aggregate product. So the aggregate product is something that the company is not going to make because it is a combination of many different products, but it establishes an overall production level for period after period after period. And we have to make sure that all the necessary resources are available to be able to meet those production goals. So here is an example of the aggregating process. Suppose if you have a company that produces these 6 different lawn products. Okay. Now, you're not going to do an aggregate plan for each and every one of them. You have to now combine all of these 6 different models. And as you can see, 1 unit of this is not the same as 1 unit of that, or any other product for that matter. The resources needed, the labor needed, the materials needed are going to be different. So you cannot simply say 1 unit of this is plus 1 unit. So if you want to produce, so you can't say that if you have a demand of 100 of this and 100 of this, then the aggregate of between these two is 200. No, because that 200 is not, and these two are not addable. So we have to come up with some way of combining all of this. Maybe one of the ways to do this is to give factors, like if this is the basic factor of 1, so this is 1.2, and this is 1.05, or this is 1.8, or something like that. Or you can convert everything into dollar amount. So that is another way of adding all of the different products. Here is the over 9-month period, the aggregate plan for the different months. So this is done in monthly. Some companies do the aggregate plan monthly. Some companies do it quarterly for 6 quarters. So aggregate plan combines appropriate resources in general terms, as we've been talking about. So it is part of a larger production planning system, because aggregate plan is not what we're going to make. It only tells us what will be the overall production level. So we have to disaggregate in the short term. So that's your short term planning. You take the aggregate plan and then break it down into individual products, and then you do the scheduling for the individual products. So to that extent, aggregate plan is not the only plan that we will be dealing with. So it's part of a larger production planning system. And disaggregation allows us to, we have to do disaggregation to bring the aggregate plan down to individual products. And then from that individual products, the production plan we develop is called master production schedule. And we will talk about master production schedule in a different chapter. What are the different approaches to aggregate production planning? So the difficulty in aggregate production planning arises when the demand goes up and down. If the demand is constant, see if every quarter demand is 10,000 aggregate units, that's it, then aggregate planning becomes trivial. So you set the aggregate level of production as 10,000 units every quarter, you're done. Now, if the demand goes up and down, which is typically the case because most products will have seasonal demand, so how do you deal with those ups and downs? And there are several approaches. So one is you build inventories during lean periods so that in peak periods you can use that built up inventory to meet the demand. So that's one approach. Or you can say I'm going to lay off workers when the demand is low and hire them back when the demand is up. So varying the workforce size, that is another way of dealing with those ups and downs. We can use part-timers whenever we need, if there is an upswing, or we can use overtime. And we can also use subcontracting capacity if it is available. So if you want to maintain a stable workforce, we don't want to hire and fire. So you can use subcontracting when there is an upswing in demand. The ups and downs can probably be evened out to some extent by offering incentives during the lean period. So the lean period will not be so lean, and during the peak periods you can try to maybe charge premium, so that would decrease the peak period demand, and it'll probably the ups and downs will not be that severe, and that would ease the difficulties faced during the aggregate planning process.